The official record is a brittle thing. It states with bureaucratic finality that the widow Capet was transferred from the Conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution on the morning of October 16, 1793. It notes the presence of the tribunal's representatives, the armed escort, the final procession. This record speaks of a legal transition, a procedural bookend to a state trial. It is a document of surfaces. It says nothing of what occurred in the hours preceding that transfer, in the damp stone silence of the Queen's cell and the adjacent administrative chambers. To understand that, one must disregard the record and examine the institution that generated it. The era is year 2 of the French Republic, one and indivisible. The air is thick with the ideology of la patrie en danger, the homeland in danger. The institution is the Revolutionary Tribunal, operating under the Committee of Public Safety. Its power is not merely judicial. It is pedagogical, performative, and absolute. Its purpose is not only to judge enemies of the revolution, but to systematically dismantle them, to transform living individuals into negative examples, into anti-citizens whose eradication proves the health of the new body politic. The victim, Marie Antoinette, formerly Archduchess of Austria, Queen of France, is the ultimate specimen for this process. The method is not one of physical torture. The law of 1791 had abolished la question, but a more modern, more insidious pressure, the pressure of symbolic annihilation before the physical fact. Her captivity in the Conciergerie's sécurité cell had already been an exercise in erasure. Stripped of all titles, she was the widow Capet. Her world was reduced to a few square meters of stone, a cot, a table. Guards were rotated to prevent attachment. Her few remaining possessions, a ring, a lock of her children's hair, were catalogued and controlled. This was the preconditioning. The institution understood that to break a symbol, one must first isolate its human vessel, sever its connections to the past, and place it in a state of perpetual, monitored suspension. The pre-execution protocol began not at dawn, but in the deep night. It was an administrative operation. First, the formal reading of the verdict and sentence by the tribunal's clerk. This was done not in a court, but in her cell, transforming the space instantly from a place of waiting to a place of terminus. The language was cold, technical, enumerating the charges of treason, conspiracy with foreign powers, and depletion of the national treasury. It framed her life as a criminal ledger, its final balanced death. She was given 12 hours. This was not mercy, it was part of the apparatus. It was time for the institution to work. Following the verdict, the next phase was the arrival of the constitutional priest. This was a critical element. The Republic, officially dechristianized, still permitted a civil minister to attend the condemned. His role was not to offer solace, but to extract a final, public concession, a confession of sins and a recognition of the sovereignty of the people. It was a political sacrament. The priest represented a bridge the state sought to burn. He was there to ensure she crossed it on their terms, to renounce her past allegiances to God and to monarchy, and acknowledge the new moral authority. Refusal would be noted, a final mark of counter-revolutionary obstinacy. Simultaneously, in a neighboring office, the material preparations were made. This was the domain of the exécuteur des hautes œuvres, the executioner Charles Henry Sanson and his aides. Theirs was a technical checklist. They required specific measurements. A deputy was sent to observe the prisoner, to assess height, posture, neck structure. This was not done with malice, but with the detached precision of a carpenter measuring for a fixture. The information was for the calibration of the guillotine's lunette, the headstock, and the basket. The Queen's body was, at this point, being processed as a logistical problem. The infamous shearing of her hair, the tonsure, would come later at the foot of the scaffold, a public ritual of dehumanization. But the planning for it happened here in the quiet of the night, as the specifications were written down. The most profound pressure, however, was psychological and legalistic. She was presented with paper and ink. She was expected to write final letters to her children, to her sister-in-law, Madame Elisabeth. This was a trap disguised as a courtesy. Every word would be scrutinized by the public prosecutor, Fauquier Tinville, and his clerks. Any phrase that could be construed as coded, any expression of loyalty to the old order, any denial of the tribunal's legitimacy would be seized upon. The letters were never truly private. They were a final interrogation. The institution offered her the pen so it could watch her mind work one last time, hoping to find in her farewells further validation of its judgment. Thus, the night passed, not in screams or resistance, but in a suffocating blanket of procedure. Each interaction, the clerk, the priest, the silent observer from Sanson's team, was a thread tightening around her. Each was a reminder that she was no longer a person but a case file approaching its final annotation. The goal was to produce a prisoner who was psychologically prepared for the ritual of the morrow, compliant, emptied of regal identity, a blank substrate upon which the state's ultimate lesson could be inscribed by the blade. By dawn, the human being had been systematically processed. What remained was a condemned body, a political object, ready for its final public utility. Dawn on October 16 did not bring light so much as it brought clarity. The theoretical sentence of the night now assumed physical form. The transition from prisoner-in-waiting to executed body was a state-managed operation of meticulous, impersonal stages. This was the domain of the protocol, where human emotion was treated as a variable to be controlled, and the body as state property to be transferred from one jurisdiction, the judicial, to another, the penal. The first visible step was the arrival of the gendarmerie escort, not as a mob, but as a drilled unit. Their function was threefold: security, spectacle, and sequence. They formed a hollow square in the conciergerie's inner courtyard, a human corridor designed to funnel the prisoner from the realm of the law to the realm of the street. Their presence was a wall of blue coats and tricorn hats, a deliberate replacement of the royal red or the palace guard's finery with the uniform of the Republic. The officer in charge carried not a scepter but a rolled parchment, the proces verbal of execution, the document that would travel with the prisoner and be signed at each stage, a chain of custody. Inside the cell, the final personal transformations were administered. She was made to change into the plain white chemise of the condemned. This garment was significant. It was not a prisoner's uniform, but a shroud-like outfit meant for the blade. It was loose, to facilitate the binding of hands later, and white, to starkly contrast with the blood, creating a clear visual report for the crowd. Her personal clothing was inventoried and removed, the last layer of her individual identity catalogued and filed away. She was then allowed a simple request, a glass of wine and a piece of bread. This was less an act of compassion than a procedural step, akin to fueling a machine before its final task. It stabilized the subject, preventing a fainting spell that would disrupt the timetable. The binding of the hands was the definitive moment of transition. It was performed not by a brutish jailer, but by the executioner's aide, a specialist in this specific task. The elbows were tied behind the back with a leather cord, tightly enough to restrict movement but with a specific technical consideration. The knot had to be secure yet allow the arms to be pulled forward efficiently at the scaffold for placement into the bass fowl, the restraining board. This was engineering. The prisoner's body was being prepped for compatibility with the device. She protested once, asking that her hands not be bound, citing dignity and precedent. The request was denied with a flat recitation of standard procedure. The state's machinery did not accommodate individual precedent. The procession itself was a moving tableau of institutional power. It moved at a deliberate walking pace, not a rushed march, not a funeral crawl. The timing was calculated. The route from the Conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution, formerly Place Louis XV, soon to be Place de la Concorde, was the longest possible through dense Parisian quarters. This was not an accident. It was a vital segment of the punishment, the prolonged exposure. The cart, an open hay wagon, elevated the prisoner for maximum visibility. She was no longer in a carriage or a closed tumbril. She was on display, seated on a plain plank, her back to the horse, facing the mounted gendarme who held the proces verbal. The escort kept the crowd at a precise distance, close enough for her to hear their insults, for them to see her face, but not so close as to allow a seizure or a disruption. The crowd's reaction was part of the spectacle, a gauge of the people's alignment with the tribunal's justice. But the true focus of this phase was not the crowd, nor even the prisoner. It was the delegation from the tribunal and the committee that shadowed the procession in a closed carriage. These men, Fauquier Tinville's deputies, representatives of Robespierre, were not there for vengeance. They were auditors. Their role was to observe the smooth functioning of the protocol, to ensure the symbolic narrative unfolded correctly. They monitored the prisoner's demeanor for signs of collapse or defiance, either of which could be politically problematic. A collapse might evoke pity, undermining the message of justified eradication. A defiance could galvanize hidden sympathizers. The ideal subject, from the institution's perspective, was one of numb, silent compliance, a walking validation of its overwhelming authority. Arrival at the Place de la Révolution was the next system's checkpoint. The guillotine stood not as a monstrous specter, but as a civic apparatus, its red-painted wood and polished bronze blade gleaming in the autumn light. A technical team was already present, having performed the morning's tests. Sanson directed the positioning of the cart. The prisoner was assisted down, not pulled but guided with firm, impersonal hands. The final, swift actions here were a well-rehearsed drill. The quick walk up the steps, the immediate positioning against the bascule, the tilting board, the securing of the body with the leather torso strap, the lowering of the lunette. The famous shearing of the hair at the neckline was not an act of petty cruelty, but a necessary technical step to ensure the blade's path was unobstructed. Every second of delay was a risk to the solemn, terrifying efficiency the state wished to project. The sound that followed was not a cheer, but a massive collective exhalation from the crowd, a sound of awe, release, and completed purpose. The blade's fall was the period at the end of the state's sentence, but for the institution the operation was only two-thirds complete. The body, now a separate object, entered its final administrative phase. The blade's fall was a public terminus. The work that followed was private, clinical, and concerned with the management of remnants. The institution's responsibility did not end with death. It extended to the neutralization of the physical relic and the documentation of the entire sequence. The goal was to transform a moment of violent spectacle into a closed administrative file, leaving no tangible focal point for memory or martyrdom. The first action was one of startling efficiency. As the basket containing the head was lifted, an aide immediately produced a coarse canvas sack. The head was transferred into it without ceremony. The body, released from the bascule, was similarly handled. Both were placed into a single, large wicker hamper kept at the scaffold's base for this precise purpose. This was not a coffin. It was a container for disposal. The blood, pooling on the platform's grooved boards, was sluiced with buckets of water carried by the executioner's assistants, the runoff draining into the sand and sawdust below. The physical evidence of the event was being systematically erased from the public view even as the crowd still murmured. Within minutes the platform was clean, the blade reset and cocked. The machine was ready for its next function. The hamper was loaded onto a simple, unmarked cart, distinct from the procession wagon. Its destination was the cemetery of the Madeleine, a common burial ground for the guillotined. The burial detail, supervised by a clerk from the mairie, operated under strict orders. The graves were mass trenches, dug in advance and quicklime-lined. The procedure was designed for chemical and biological erasure, not memorial. The hamper's contents were emptied into the pit. No prayers were recited, no markers were placed. Quicklime was shoveled over the remains, initiating a rapid, anonymizing decomposition. The earth was then filled in and tamped down. The clerk made a notation in the burial register, often just a number or a generic entry, un fem or the date and location. The geography of the grave was not recorded. The state had created a null point in the earth. Back at the Conciergerie and the tribunal, the paper trail was being finalized. The procès verbal of execution, signed by Sanson, the officer of the gendarmerie and the tribunal's deputies, was filed. It certified the completion of the sentence in conformity with the law. The prisoner's personal effects, inventoried the night before, were now officially sealed as state property, destined for storage or liquidation at the Domaine National. The cell in the Conciergerie was stripped, the cot linen burned, the walls whitewashed. It was made ready for its next occupant within hours. The institution could not afford sentiment, not even the haunted memory of a place. Efficiency demanded a clean slate. The public narrative was managed through the official press, Le Moniteur Universal, and the various revolutionary journals. The reporting was brief, factual, and devoid of the lurid details that characterized pamphlet literature. The emphasis was on legality and finality. The widow Capet underwent her punishment today at the Place de la Révolution. Justice has been satisfied. The focus quickly pivoted within days to the next trials, the next conspiracies, the Girondins, the Hébertists. Marie Antoinette's execution was not framed as a climax, but as one completed task in the ongoing work of national purification. To dwell on it would grant it undue significance. The state's discourse moved on, deliberately leaving a silence in its wake. This silence, however, became the legacy. The absence of a body, the lack of a grave, the clinical erasure, these did not end the story. They created a vacuum. Almost immediately, counter-narratives began to seep into this vacuum. Rumors, forged memoirs, and clandestine portraits circulated. Stories emerged of secret royalist rites at the Madeleine Cemetery, of a heart secretly retrieved, a later disputed relic, of final words of piety or defiance that the official record omitted. The very efficiency of the state's deletion process spawned a mythology of survival and sanctification. The institution had sought to produce a negative example. It inadvertently produced a ghost, a focal point for nostalgia, royalist propaganda, and later romantic tragedy. The echo is found not in the blade's impact, but in the administrative perfection that surrounded it. The true historical weight lies in the prototype it established. The modern state's capacity to use legal and bureaucratic machinery to legitimize annihilation, to process a human being from sovereign individual to criminal case filed to sanitized biological waste, all under the cold light of law and public safety. The conciergerie cell, the bound hands, the measured procession, the quicklime pit, these are not scenes of barbarism, but of a chilling, systematic order. The legacy of October 16, 1793 is not merely the death of a queen, but the first full demonstration of how power, when it becomes purely procedural, can erase a person and attempt to manage the memory of that erasure. The silence it left behind was its only flaw, and that silence has never ceased to speak.